The first results of the negotiations to end Russia's war against Ukraine have appeared, and to put it mildly, they are surprising. The first day of negotiations in Abu Dhabi between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations has ended. After that, the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin urgently called the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And interestingly, on the same day, Xi Jinping spoke on the phone with the American leader Donald Trump to discuss Ukraine, Iran, and trade. It was stated that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin discussed strengthening and expanding their countries' military relations. Putin and Xi Jinping unofficially discussed possible negotiation positions on Ukraine. At the same time, American sources claim that today's talks in Abu Dhabi between the delegations of Ukraine, the United States, and Russia may have a more promising outcome than previously expected. Moreover, in Washington, they are predicting a breakthrough to the point that military actions could stop as early as this spring. But on the other hand, Ukrainian sources at the talks insist that Ukraine is relying on its own military forces, since they don't really believe that Europe and the United States would actually fight for Ukraine in the event of another Russian attack. That is why Kyiv insists on strong armament for the armed forces of Ukraine and maintaining their numbers. And here, the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, stated that if Ukraine agrees to the deployment of European troops on its territory, then supposedly Kyiv does not want peace. At the same time, there was encouraging news that a large-scale prisoner exchange between Ukraine and Russia may take place in the near future. At the same time, American President Donald Trump assures that Vladimir Putin has kept his word regarding the energy truce. But his words are contradicted by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which directly states that the truce lasted for 4 days, not a week, as the American president claims. In general, let's discuss the initial results of the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, what was going on around them, what was discussed, and what breakthroughs the parties are announcing. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give a like, and leave any comment under this video. Also subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There you will also find links to platforms and details that you can use to support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or paid subscription. I will be grateful for any support from you. So, the Ukrainian, American, and Russian delegations have completed the first day of peace talks taking place in Abu Dhabi. The talks lasted nearly 5 hours and will resume tomorrow. And it's worth noting that the parties are meeting after a massive Russian shelling of Ukrainian energy infrastructure at the height of the cold, which took place during an energy truce. I'll make an important digression now. Let me remind you that the day before, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that the Russians broke the energy truce, which Donald Trump personally asked Vladimir Putin for. Supposedly, the truce was supposed to last a week, at least that's what the Americans claimed, but it lasted less than 4 days. And now Donald Trump responded to this statement with the following words, quote, "The pause lasted from Sunday to Sunday. It ended, and Putin has now dealt them a heavy blow. Putin kept his word. 1 week is a long time. We will accept anything."
It's very, very cold.
Well, first of all, it's a disgrace when the President of the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world, says we will accept anything from some bald dictator, Vladimir Putin. And secondly, Trump's statement that the ceasefire lasted from Sunday to Sunday was strongly refuted by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. If we follow Donald Trump's statement, then the energy ceasefire lasted from January 25 to February 1. However, official reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense say the opposite. Strikes on Ukraine's energy facilities continued at least on January 25, 26, and 27. On these days, there were reports of energy facilities being hit in Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, and Donetsk regions, and in the Kharkiv region, up to 80% of residents were left without power. The Russian Ministry of Defense stopped mentioning strikes on energy facilities only on January 28, and already on January 29, Trump and Zelensky announced a week-long pause, which the Kremlin confirmed a little later. Nevertheless, at the beginning of February, Russia resumed massive attacks. During Kyiv's coldest period, thousands of homes lost power, which Zelensky said broke Vladimir Putin's promises. Thus, statements by Russian official bodies contradict Donald Trump's words that the energy truce was indeed observed. But according to Trump's logic, Putin kept his word once again. The truce began on February 25 from Sunday to Sunday, at least the 25th through the 27th. During these 3 days, Russia struck at the energy sector, and the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reported on it. Let's return to the negotiations in Abu Dhabi. The second round will last 2 days. Today, February 4th, and tomorrow, the 5th. After the Russian Federation violated the energy ceasefire, the work of the Ukrainian negotiation team was adjusted. Kyiv supports United States de-escalation efforts and expects Moscow to do the same. Among the topics of the negotiations was the exchange of prisoners, which Moscow has effectively halted. At the moment, there have been no public statements from Ukrainian officials, but the Kremlin has announced its ultimatum to Ukraine. The spokesperson for the Russian dictator Dmitry Peskov stated that Moscow supposedly keeps the doors open for a peaceful settlement, but, quote, Ukraine has not yet made the appropriate decisions. Russia continues its operation. In addition, the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, stated that if the Ukrainian side presents security ideas at the negotiations in Abu Dhabi that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte previously voiced in Kyiv. This will suggest that Volodymyr Zelensky allegedly opposes peace, which is the main topic at these negotiations. Let me remind you, in his speech at the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on February 3rd, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated that European troops, with the support of the United States of America, will appear on Ukrainian territory immediately after the signing of a peace agreement. Supposedly, it is these troops that will provide security guarantees for Ukraine. Moreover, there is even a formula for how these troops will operate according to the security guarantee plans. In the event of another Russian attack on Ukraine, the armed forces of Ukraine will fight off the Russians alone during the first 24 hours, while the West will send a diplomatic warning to Moscow during those 24 hours. If the Russian attack continues after this warning, then no later than 72 hours after it begins, Western troops are obligated to enter the war on Ukraine's side to repel the Russian attack. And now Sergei Lavrov, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, declares that Moscow completely rejects any security guarantees for Ukraine from the West, calling it, quote, the creation of a springboard for an attack on Russia. Now, strange messages appear. Ukrainian officials anonymously state that in Kyiv, it is increasingly assumed that any future agreements on peace will not be able to guarantee Ukraine's long-term security. In the context of uncertainty with international commitments, the focus is on Ukraine's own forces. This is what the publication Politico writes about today. Supposedly, during negotiations, Ukraine is increasingly considering a scenario in which it will have to independently ensure protection against a possible new attack by Russia within the European Union. Let me remind you, earlier there were calls to turn Ukraine into a steel hedgehog, unable to become easy prey for current or future aggressors. We're talking about forming a permanent large army, developing drone technologies, missile programs, and our own weapons production. But all of this in integration with Europe. This requires a deep reform of the defense sector, an overhaul of the procurement system, modernization of recruitment approaches, and significant financial investment. And here, during the negotiations, the question arises, why do the guarantees from our allies cause so much doubt? The key problem lies in the absence of clear international commitments comparable to NATO's collective defense mechanisms. Without membership in the alliance, Ukraine is forced to rely on bilateral agreements which still do not carry the same weight. Additional concerns are also raised by the unpredictability of Washington's position because on one hand, the United States Congress must ratify security guarantees and they will become binding. But it's hard to imagine that Donald Trump would start a war with Russia over Ukraine. Moreover, it's already clear that Donald Trump won't even impose new sanctions against Russia for violating the ceasefire. But what if? For Trump, Putin kept his word, even though in reality he didn't keep it regarding the energy truce. When Trump says we'll accept anything, Well, it's very hard to hope that this same Donald Trump, in the event of another Russian attack, will say, well, we promised. Probably we need to enter the war, but I really doubt that, which is why Ukraine is pushing the idea of having the strongest army in Europe during negotiations. It is known that during the negotiations, Ukraine insists on keeping an army of about 800,000 servicemen. However, even in the case of a truce, maintaining such a structure will require enormous resources and systematic support, which is why the issue of this kind of support from Europe is being discussed. This 800,000 strong army is expected to be supported by both Ukraine and European unions, which should invest in defense against Russia. And it was at these negotiations that it was finally stated directly, legally. Binding agreements with the United States and European countries, as well as the possible presence of multinational troops in Ukraine, are considered only as a supplement to Ukraine's own defense. Like, first, all the allies must invest in our defense in the armed forces of Ukraine to preserve this powerful army, and everything else is just a supplement. It's kind of a bonus, if you will, to put it bluntly. At the same time, the publication Politica assures that despite public statements, both sides are actually more constructive, which, I have to admit, is an adjective that is often misused and misinterpreted. Therefore, the American delegation is confident that the negotiations may have a more promising outcome than previously expected, and even a breakthrough is expected in the form of agreements that hostilities may stop or decrease in intensity as early as this spring. Against this backdrop, something interesting is happening. Vladimir Putin, during negotiations in Abu Dhabi, urgently called the Chinese leader Xi Jinping to discuss what to do next. This was the first conversation this year between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, as both seek to move away. And according to the South China Morning Post, Xi Jinping stated that the relationship between China and Russia is on the right track and that the two countries need a grand plan to develop their ties. Putin in turn told Xi Jinping that the China-Russia relationship is a stabilizing factor in times of global turbulence. They also discussed other issues like Russia's negotiating positions on the war against Ukraine. But there was something more behind this conversation. Because on the same day, Xi Jinping spoke on the phone with United States President Donald Trump. And the American leader said that he discussed trade, military issues, Trump's upcoming trip to China in April, Russia's war against Ukraine, the situation with Iran, and the issue of Beijing purchasing American oil with his Chinese counterpart. This three-way conversation between Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin is crucial for the Abu Dhabi talks. But we will discuss this topic with you in more detail in the next episode on this channel. I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. And if you found this episode interesting and useful, you can support it with your donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye.